Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tracy Cook and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Business Process Management for BAs. Today's featured speaker is Mark Monteleone CBAP, PMP, and our webinar presenter. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to use the question toolbox to submit your questions in advance. Today, I'd like to say thank you to RG Freeman Group for sponsoring today's event. And at this time, I will turn it over to Lou Bergner to say a few words before we get started.
Hello, my name is Lou Bergner. The RG Freeman Group is a learning solutions company focused on educating IT, business, and management professionals through a broad range of knowledge transfer and consulting services. We specialize in delivering training and consulting services for enterprise business process solutions in the business analysis, project management, and agile transformation and IT service management fields. The RG Freeman Group facilitators are recognized for their ability to provide instruction of theory and their ability to ground that theory in real-life applications. For more information about the RGF Freeman Group programs, refer to the contact information at the bottom of this slide. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Mark Monteleone.
Mark, are you off mute?
No, I was not, so I am off now. Okay, folks, I want to thank you very much for attending the webinar, and I also want to certainly thank the folks from Modern Analyst and the RGF group for sponsoring this webinar. I'm speaking to you from Houston, Texas. It's great weather today, sunny. It's going to get up to about 70 degrees. You'll see a slide in front of you right now. You'll see that there is a website at the bottom of the slide. Let me just sort of point to it here with my cursor. You can use this to go to my website and download a copy of the presentation if you wish. I will show this slide again at the end of the presentation, or at least this particular website. Okay, our topic today is business process management. Let's just give a short definition of this and talk a little bit about it. First of all, BPM, I'll use that acronym here, is an effective strategy for running a business. Its goal is to ensure that the products that a business produces are effective, that is, it's what the customer wants, and that the processes that we use are in fact efficient. So it's an effective strategy for running a business. Now, this is a different kind of approach than what we've seen in the past. In the 80s, we went to an approach like this, so looking at processes rather than functions of a business to manage the business. We'll look at that a little bit more here as we go through the slides. Okay, so if we take a look, okay, at our goals, we want to have effective products and we want to have efficient processes. And in using BPM, we take a look at our objectives in implementing improvements to these processes, or perhaps maybe even redesigning the processes altogether. Let me just say that it is a fact that many businesses today, in fact, since the 80s, have been advising their BAs to focus more on processes rather than, say, coming up with requirements for, say, new software, okay, in their business. They're finding they're getting more bang for the buck by just looking at their processes. Let's pose a scenario. Let's just say you're a BA and you've joined a company. Let's say this company you're not familiar with, And typically what happens is that first thing they give you is this organization chart. And you can see there's an image of like an organization chart where you have the top person at the top, and then you have all these various different functions, and perhaps maybe the managers and maybe some other descriptive information. This is called a typical organization chart. It's not surprising that you receive one of these. Traditionally, businesses have been run by function rather than by process. Okay, but if we think about it, this particular organization chart doesn't really give us how our products are made. In other words, it doesn't tell us anything about processes.
Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Which slide number are you on right now?
I'm on slide 3.
Okay, my apologies. We're seeing that fine. Thank you.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so let's take a look at what you would like in terms of a business analyst. Typically, what you would want is 3 things. Rather than the organization chart, which does tell you a lot of things about the function of a business, you would like to have models of the core processes. In other words, these models would represent how we build products, how we offer various services. That's one. Number 2 is what you'd like to know, well, who are the owners of those various different core processes? Hopefully there is some manager or managers that are responsible for those processes. And the third thing that you would like are metrics. What metrics do these process owners use to evaluate the performance of these processes, in that do they meet these processes, do they meet the expectations of the owners? Okay, so you're given an organization chart, but what you would like as a BA is to understand, well, what do the models look like of these core processes so I can get familiar with them? Who owns these processes? It's going to be very important to know, because these core owners are going to have, risk tolerances to change. And in addition to that, these different process owners are going to have to approve any changes that you may recommend. The third thing, of course, are the metrics. How do you measure a process's performance? Is it meeting expectations or not? So those are the 3 things. Okay, with that, I'm going to back up the truck, as they say here in Texas, and talk a little bit about myself. Just very quickly, yes, I have written a book, and it's called The 20-Minute Business Analyst. I've been in the business for a long time, as it says on this chart, about 40 years, and you can tell that just by looking at my bobblehead that was given to me by my family at Christmas time. And I can tell you, for being a business analyst and a project manager for many years, I can tell you right up front, you're going to lose your hair, okay, as that's what this little bobblehead represents here. I do have a number of certifications, and one of them is a Scrum Master, and it's, well, I can tell you that that's probably the certification that has got me into most trouble, in that I did fill out a resume once, and unfortunately I left out the R. And to many of my friends, I think they still call me the Scum Master rather than Scrum Master. So anyway, I've been around for a while. I've done a lot of these various different things, both in process and in coming up with requirements for software. Okay, enough about me. Let's take a look at our agenda. If you look at the agenda, particularly what we published, was that we were going to address 6 questions concerning BPM. And we've sort of talked about the first question already, about if you were a business analyst, what would you ask for when joining a business? And we said that there were 3 things, and we'll go to those 3 things again in a minute. But these other questions are also very important. What's the difference between managing, okay, I'm on the second question, managing a business, okay, by function rather than by process? Look at the third question. Why would you redesign the process rather than incrementally improve it? Fourth question. Why would your process analysis covers something called a value chain rather than just a sub-process of that value chain. So we'll talk about that. Down to question number 5, we're going to start looking at metrics. We'll be looking at leading and lagging metrics. This is in the control area. This, in the sense, is our legacy that we leave after we're doing an analysis. And then the last one is most interesting. What's the most challenging part? Is it improving the process, or is it managing the resistance that you can expect from various different individuals, okay, on changing the process? Many people have said it's easy to change things, but it's much more difficult to change people. All right, so we're going to address these various ones. In addition to that, I can tell you that this particular deck of slides, I've also put in it a quick reference checklist on doing BPM. I'll show you what that checklist looks like a bit later. And also there's a glossary that has explanations of the various different BPM terms and how to use them, as well as references that I use to come up with these particular slides. Okay, so with that, let's go back to the original question. Question 1. As a business analyst, what should you ask for when you join a business? As I said before, most likely people are going to give you a organization chart, which is great. It shows lots of different functions. It shows the pecking order of the business, but it doesn't show you how things get made or how we provide various services. We also want to make sure that we have process owners, people that are responsible, okay, for the managing of those processes. Hopefully they're looking at some metrics. Lots of times you might ask that question, you find out that they're not. And also those particular individuals are the ones that approve changes to processes. The last one, as we said, was metrics. How do these things get evaluated? How do we know that our processes are in fact meeting our expectations? So I would ask for these 3 things, and let me just say, if you don't have models, you don't have owners, and if you don't have metrics, your processes are out of control. All right, so there's a real opportunity for you there in terms of a business analyst. Okay, with that, let's take a look at processes. There are various different ways to model them, and I'm going to show you 3 different ways because you may receive different formats depending on who you work for. The first one is a flowchart. You can see it's a single point of view, okay, a single point of view. And this single point of view is going to tell you, let's say, as we look at this one, it says first particular task is drive car to shop. And this particular flowchart talks about going to a business and changing your oil. And it shows the single point of view of the customer. And that's the important thing here. This is called a flowchart. It's probably the simplest, the oldest one used. In fact, I'm sure there's going to be a point in time where a tomb will be opened up in, say, Egypt, and they're going to see a flow chart on the wall, probably using hieroglyphics to show how they build the pyramids. Single point of view. That's really what to remember here about flowcharts. Okay, but obviously, various different individuals, we'll call them actors, can participate in a particular flow, that is, for a process. And you might use something called a activity model with swim lanes. And you can see here, instead of just the customer, we have several points of view. I have a customer and a customer service representative, auto mechanic, perhaps a valet. And we show the various different tasks, okay, that these different actors participate in. So you see we still have the customer that drives the car to the shop, but now there is something that the customer service person is doing, the representative, by providing the various options to a customer. Okay, so the important part here about this particular one is multiple points of view, and it's called an activity model with swim lane, and in fact it's part of what we call UML. the unified modeling language that is represented, and it's used a lot here of course, in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, multiple points of view. So I've shown you two. Let's look at the third one. This is called Business Process Modeling and Notation. Now, this is a different application, but it shows that I can have multiple pools with swim lanes, and it's really quite useful if you run, say, a global company and you have various different partners from various different locations. Well, let's say they may be foreign locations, they may be domestic locations, but you can represent processes which in this technique, okay, they're called orchestrations, but then there can be communications, flows of information between various pools. So those things are called collaborations. And then you might even have, and it shows here in the middle of this slide, this particular group, those things are called choreographies, where in fact I personally call them a graphic use case if you're into that particular technique. But it shows various different ways, okay, that processes can be portrayed in using this modeling technique. So, flowcharts, single point of view. Activity model with swim lanes, multiple points of view. And then, of course, you can have multiple pools with swim lanes using BPMN. Let me just say the business process modeling and notation is also part of UML. Okay, so you could receive these models, okay, in different formats. Now, there's one interesting thing that I wanted to point out, and it's something that I would encourage you to look at. This is another example of BPMN, okay, Business Process Modeling and Notation. And you'll notice that there are certain things that are called gateways. They're in the form of a diamond. They are, in fact, the result of decisions, okay, that are made, okay, for a particular process. But you'll notice, whether it be flowcharting or activity models with swim lanes or BPMN, it shows a decision being made, okay, and let's say here's an example here. We have decide on expenses with this particular flowchart, this particular BPMN representation, this model. And the diamond shows whether something is approved or not approved. But what it doesn't show, and what the other formats don't show, is what business rules that you use to, in fact, make that decision. None of these charts have that. Process models do not have a standard method of doing that. However, this past year, there is something that the UML folks have put out. It's called Decision Model Notation, and you'll see here on the top of the slide there is an annotation that actually you can place a hyperlink that then links to this particular format that shows business rules. Why is this important? If you look at no matter what format that you use, the business rules are not going to be stated on there. In fact, if they are, it gets really kind of, messy. And the fact is that in business today, we have a lot of people retiring. And a lot of those business rules are not documented. And as a result, that intelligence walks out the door, and yes, we may have a flow chart, but we don't know how decisions or those gateways were actually decided. I would highly encourage you to take a look at this new format, okay, this new model, decision model notation, and look at your present models, okay, as you get them, because business rules are going to be most important to you. Okay, enough of the models. Let's then take a look now at question 2. What's the difference between managing a business by function or by process? Well, if you manage by function, you're going to be using an organization chart. And that's been done traditionally for a long, long time. However, somewhere around the 80s, and in particular note, General Electric, decided that they should be looking at processes more, because processes run through the organization. They run across functions. They're not just contained within a function. And as a result, businesses learned a lot more of how to manage their processes, how to manage how their products are being made, and of course their services that are offered. So business process management is running a business via processes rather than by function. If we look at this slide, we're on slide 13 now, we have a definition here of what BPM is. It's a little more formal definition. You see it's a systematic approach, for managing a business and ensuring two particular voices that are aligned. Essentially, the customer value, that voice, of what the customer needs, what products are you offering, are you meeting their expectations, or is your services meeting their expectations? But also we have to consider the process of doing it. Is it an effective process? We want to make sure that the processes are in fact efficient and that our products are in fact effective. And in a sense, we have a business analyst that are listening to these voices in their head, as it shows here. The key here is to ensure that both these voices are aligned. Okay, so in the past, we've done things by function, but the new thought is that no, we're in fact going to take a look at these various different processes and look at how they cut across the organization. And that's an important concept when we start talking about value, so about value chain. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let me just say that business process management has a life cycle. It is a 4-stage life cycle, although you may read various things on the internet that there might be maybe 5 cycles or maybe even 6 cycles, so it depends on the author. But typically you're looking at a 4-stage process, but I want to emphasize, as it says here on the slide, that it's iterative. It is an iterative process in that you don't do it once and then stop. This is a continuous basis of managing your business. So let's talk about the life cycle and the 4 stages. The first one we have is the define stage, and probably the most important. In the define stage, hopefully you do have a process owner, and that process owner is going to state what's the objective, and hopefully they will provide a metric goal as to how they want the processes to change. That is, are they looking for a 10% improvement or a 20% improvement? Or are they looking for something much more drastic, let's say a 60% improvement? That's all defined in the define stage. It's also defined there whether you're trying to solve a particular problem that exists today, or maybe a new opportunity, or maybe it's just a periodic review of core processes. Unfortunately today, many core processes have not been reviewed, for, let's say, 20, 30 years. So that's what we do in the define stage. And after we do that, we then go into doing analysis to determine, well, what do we do today? What do we do today? What is the current process, that is, the as-is? We may have models that we have had in the past with this particular company, or we may have to create them ourselves. We may have had metrics already defined as to measuring that process, or we may need to implement metrics. So we have to define, we know what we want to do, hopefully we have a metric goal. We then go into analysis to see, well, what do we do today? And then finally we go into the stage of implement, where we said, well, what's the 2B process? What do we want to change? Well, what can be our expectation, in terms of changes, to justify the work of going from a current, that is the as-is, to a 2B, to what our future vision is. Okay, the last one, and I would not de-emphasize this, but let me just say here, control. This is your legacy. If you do implement a new process, whether it be a redesign or perhaps maybe an incremental improvement, you're going to need to leave some sort of a dashboard to control the process for your process owner. And you can look at this through the various different metrics that we're going to talk about here in some of these slides, like leading and lagging metrics. And we come up with this dashboard of reports called control reports and trend reports. Okay, so in summary, we have a 4-stage process here. It's iterative. We define what we want to do. We get that from our process owner. We do an analysis of the as-is. We implement in terms of a to-be as to what improvements we see we'd like to do. And then, of course, we have to leave some way of controlling the process as we leave this particular endeavor. All right, let me now continue on here to go to the third question. This question here has to do with redesign, okay, rather than incrementally improving a process. And you can see there are definitions there, right? These definitions, right, can be we might be wanting to do a redesign of the process entirely. Why would we do that? Well, if our process owner says, I'd like to see a 60% improvement, you're not going to get that with just doing small incremental improvements to the process. And if you're going to do that, a redesign, a different approach, okay, that you may want to consider is a product-based approach where the BA actually ignores, okay, the current process in order to promote creativity. In other words, if you use the current process for the redesign, everybody refers to that, pretty much you're going to clone the same process again, and that's what a number of people have thought. So you may want to look up this technique. I have it in my references. It's called product-based design, where the BA and the BA's team actually ignores the current process and say, well, how would we do it today with today's technology? Okay, and so in other words, these processes may have been around a long, long time, and knowing what we know today, we would maybe design that process very differently. Of course, let's say that if your process owner says, well, we're only looking for a 10% improvement or a 20% improvement, see what we can get here. Again, having a metric goal, you may then do something just called incremental improvement. Okay, so 2 different ways. And the key of choosing, okay, the key of choosing is, what does the process owner want? Do they want a very large improvement, or they're looking for something small and incremental? Think about this also. The larger the improvement, the more risk you're taking in terms of that process. Talk to your process owner. See how risk adverse or risk prone they are. We'll talk more here in a minute about how we should structure our proposals to the process owner. Remember what I said, the process owner is going to need to approve whatever changes that you make. Okay, we go on to question 4 here. Why should your process analysis cover a value chain rather than a sub-process? Sub-processes, I can tell you, and we have the definitions here, are part of value chains, and typically you'll find them within a particular function. Remember, we said that a process, a value chain, runs across the organization, right? So it will cross many different boundaries of the various different functions that are represented in the business. It is a common error that happens in these types of studies, that the business analyst is referred to look at a particular sub-process. I'm only worried about what we do here in accounting, or I'm only worried about what we do here in shipping. What we really need to look at is the value chains to make sure that when we change something, that we have a smooth value chain, okay, that is still an effective and efficient process. Let me just do an example here. You see at the bottom of the slide here we have a balloon animal. When, let's say, a particular balloon sculpturist, okay, makes, say, a dog here, And we create the nose and then the ears and then the legs. And each time we squeeze this balloon animal and we push air from one piece to the next piece to the next piece. We're doing the same thing here in terms of process analysis. We have to be aware that if we improve a sub-process, we may in fact have some unintentional consequences with the other downstream processes. So, as a good practice, what you should do is look at the entire value chain. This first also ensures that you're going to produce something that is going to be more effective, more efficient for the customer at the end, and not just make one particular function more efficient. So think about that. Think about making balloon animals, okay, and think about unintentional consequences that you may have actually caused later on in the value chain. Okay, with that, let me just show an example. This is during, say, the defined stage of a BPM effort, and you'll notice that we have a goal, and we have that portrayed right over here, okay, and it says we want to reduce time of a particular process. Let's say the process owner has said, well, some invoices are taking as long as 6 weeks, and that's causing us a cash flow problem within the business. In other words, we've got to make sure that cash comes in from accounts receivable so that we can meet payroll. And we'd like to reduce it to 1 week. Well, that's somewhat significant. All right, so you may want to then decide based on that goal and advise the process owner that we may go into a redesign rather than, how you say, incrementally improve. All right, this particular model is called a tree structure, and you'll notice that we have first identified what are the various different functions that participate in this particular process called invoicing. And you'll notice that the next step here, okay, after functions, we have sub-processes. And each of these sub-processes, they all link together to form something called a value chain. It is, I said before, it's a common error that a business analyst may just look at, let's say, submit expense report and make that very efficient, but then maybe causing other problems in these other sub-processes. What the business analyst needs to do as a good practice is to look at the entire value chain and then see how product flows, what metrics that are used in the various different places, okay, of this value chain. Okay, so what I wanted to do here was at least give an example of what we're talking about. Make sure you get a metric goal from your process owner as to what improvement are we looking at. Understand that the process is going to, or the value chain is going to go through various different functions. Identify all those sub-processes, but when you do the analysis, make sure you do it with the entire value chain in mind. Okay. One of the things that you're going to need to take a look at, particularly when you go into the control area, is leading and lagging metrics. Hopefully, your as is, whatever model that you currently have, or the process you have today, the value chain you're using today, they have metrics. And that those metrics are in fact being used by the process owner to determine if in fact the process is in fact meeting expectations. In other words, it's taking so long to do an invoice. If it's taking, let's say, 3 weeks and you were expecting 1 week, well, then you need to make some improvements in order to make sure that cash comes in quicker. All right, so we have definitions here of what we call lagging and leading. Let's just review these for a minute. The lagging metric is the metric that you would have at the end of the process. It is a historical account. It's something that you can't change. It takes us 2 weeks typically to process an invoice. That may not meet your expectation, but we can't change that. These sort of lagging indicators typically are in something called a trend report. Well, how much time has it taken us to actually do an invoice for the last 3 months? And we can look at various different results. However, we can also have some metrics within the process, and these things are things that we can change while invoices are being processed. So I look at lagging, I look at leading, and if a leading indicator tells me that it looks like the lagging indicator is going to be 3 weeks to process an invoice, then is there something that I can do within the process to make that lagging indicator come out more to my liking? Okay. That's how these metrics are used, and as again I said, this is going to be something that you're going to be wanting to look at in terms of your analysis, your implementation of whatever suggestions in terms of improvements you're going to make, and it's going to be part of coming up with that control, dashboard for your process owners. One of the analogies I like to make is baseball. So let's just think about baseball just for a minute. Baseball is an interesting game. It is a true management sport in that very different from, say, soccer. When the soccer whistle blows and the game starts, the managers are out of it. There's no timeouts or anything like that. But in baseball, we can make all kinds of adjustments, okay? Managers can call timeout based on various things they see that's happening on the field. So the thing that I want you to take a look at first, of course, is the scoreboard. That's the lagging metric. That's the indicator, and that's something historically we cannot change. In other words, if the score at inning 4 in baseball is 5-3, that's it. It's 5-3. We're on to the next inning. And of course, whatever the score is at the end of, say, 9 innings, or maybe additional innings might be required. But what the manager is doing in the dugout is looking at various indicators as to what's happening during the game. And one of the major ones, a leading indicator, is pitch count. When the pitch count gets so high, the manager knows that that ball is going to be being thrown to home plates is going to be a bit slower. As a result, there's going to be batters that are going to be able to hit that ball a lot better. So what the manager does is then look at that particular metric, that leading indicator, and then do a corrective action in changing pitchers. Right? So they look at in a sense, like a root cause analysis, and they determine, well, what needs to be done to make sure that our lagging indicator is going to be to our liking. And they may do a root cause, or what they call a fishbone diagram, or some people call it Ishikawa diagram, using the originator's name. And they may use then a technique called the 5 why analysis. So the next time you go see a baseball game, think about that. I know when I take my grandchildren to see a baseball game, I demand for them to always keep track of the pitch count and various different metrics, okay, that are happening on the field. I guess, unfortunately, I may have ruined the game of baseball for them, but it is an interesting way of keeping track of how you progress, and using this analogy, okay, for keeping track of processes to make sure that they are meeting the expectations of the process owners. Okay, let's just talk about the dashboard for a minute. I said that these metrics are going to be used for control reports. This is primarily your leading indicators, but it also will be used for trend reports for your lagging indicators. All right, so this is an example of like a process owner dashboard. We have established certain metrics so that we can then look to see, okay, all right, I can see what my trend reports is leading in terms of, let's say, my invoices, how long they're taking to be processed. Or I'll look at And if I'm not happy with that, I could then look over to my control reports and see, well, what are some of the metrics that are happening within the process? And are they meeting expectations? And maybe I need to take some corrective action here. Keep this in mind, that the process owner, in using this reports, the control report, is going to show you possibly where, not why, where the problem exists and what you could probably then do, okay, in that location to hopefully your trend reports meeting your expectations, that is your lagging indicators. But it only tells you where. It doesn't tell you why. Well, for why, we need to look at that particular location and do something called a root cause analysis. And I just thought I would bring in here an example, okay, of, let's say we have a process that has some inefficiency. And in this particular one, this is one that I use and look at various different aspects of where I could possibly find where the problem resides. It could be on primary users. It could be, gosh, maybe these users weren't trained properly. That is, the individuals, the actors that are doing the various different tasks. Or it could be information flow, or it could be performance measurements are not adequate. There could be various different aspects. I could then take one of those aspects that I think that there might be a problem, okay, at the location that the leading metric indicated to me, and then start doing something called a root cause analysis using the 5 why technique. And I just thought I'd show you at least an example, okay, of doing this. Here we have at the head of this, of the fishbone, as they call it, a process inefficiency. And we look to see, well, are there problems in here that could be causing us not to meet our expectation for the leading metric? And it may be fairly simple. I spot the problem and I can come up with the root cause for whatever aspect that may be. And maybe, let's say, business decisions. But oftentimes it's not that easy. It could be that we spot a problem, but that's caused by something else, and that is caused by something else. And in that case, we would then use a technique called the 5 whys. So let's say there's another problem, and we say, well, why did that happen? And that's our first question, why? And then we said, well, this cause A caused this problem number 2 to happen, but then this was caused by cause B. So I ask why, and I may go as far as 5 times to finally get to the root cause. So that's how we use this particular technique. Again, we have our dashboard. I've got a control report. The control report shows me where there may be a possible problem. In other words, that leading metric is going to not meet expectations for the lagging metric. And then I can do an Ishikawa diagram or a fishbone with various different aspects, and then use the 5 whys to come down to what corrective action that I wish to take. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the flow there, okay, and that that dashboard, that control panel, that control stage of BPM is going to be most important to you for the legacy that you leave the process owner. All right, with that, let's go to the, you can see here are some other root causes that may come up. And you can see that the model is going to expand quite a bit. Let me just suggest this, that as you go through this, make sure that whoever you're working with understands that you're using this 5 why technique, because you can be, how you say, sound like an annoying child after a while. All right, so explain the technique to them so they know exactly what you're doing. All right. Here comes now to question 6. This is an interesting one. I can tell you up front that no matter what project I've had, I have always managed to find resistance to whatever change that you want to implement. And that's what it says here, right? What is the most challenging part of BPM? Is it improving the process or managing the resistance to change? And you should keep this in mind. Keep it in mind during the entire project. Don't manage resistance or wait for it to happen. Assume it will happen. And think of this, the following things that I'm going to mention to you in terms of making your proposal to your process owner. Remember, a person has to approve your change, and think about what their risk tolerance is. Resistance, let me just say, is a common reaction. We're all comfortable in what we're doing today. And when someone wants to make a change, people look at it suspiciously. There might be a lack of trust. I've never worked with you before. I may have different perceptions of impact. So we need to understand a person's, that is the process owner's, risk tolerance. All right? Are they risk prone? Are they risk adverse? In fact, what I would highly recommend to you is to consider risk in the proposals, your improvements, your changes to the process owner. Form, let's say, 3, not just 1, but say 3 proposals based on risk that we are assuming by making these changes to the process. Don't just come up with 1. Look at it as we could do this change and it would provide this benefit, and that's a minimum of risk. But we could take on an additional, efficiency, but we would have to take on an additional risk, and then maybe another change for an additional risk. So now the process owner can then, depending on that person's tolerance, can decide how much risk they want to take. Or maybe we'll do this right now and then we'll do maybe something else 3 months from now. I want you to think about that in terms of your presentation as to improvements. Always consider risk, and I know you probably have worked on maybe a particular proposal and says, God, this just looks like the greatest thing since sliced bread. How can anybody be against it? They will. Remember that these are various things that are going to imply various different risks. Now, what I have put in this presentation to answer this question is, what can I look at in terms of risk to various changes to processes, in terms of risk prevention, or risk resistance prevention, but then also corrective action when risk is now, in your face. Let's take a look at the first one. This is from Kotter. He is a very famous person for the 8 steps of resistance prevention. And I'm only going to address the first 3 of these. They're most important. If you take a look at the first one, it's all about urgency. Many of us propose changes without really providing enough information so that whoever the stakeholder is, and in this case a process owner, understands that if we don't do this, what are the repercussions? In other words, what's the urgency of making this change? Convince me. If you don't go that far of saying what the urgency is, they're not just going to say yes to your change. In fact, whatever proposals that you make, all of them may in fact be turned down. So you have to create this urgency in the business. If we don't do this, then this might happen, or this will happen. After you've established the urgency, then you can come up with a coalition of people that support those particular changes, and you then, of course, create your vision. So I want you to think about that in terms of how much risk are we taking on? How can I use this resistance prevention? Well, number one is when you start talking about these things, talk about the urgency to the business. Don't just say that we need to make this particular change to make it more efficient. If we don't make it efficient, well, will our customers go somewhere else? So you have to talk about it in terms of the business and the urgency that will happen if these changes are not taken on. There are other steps here all the way down to step 8, and in the last slide, actually I think it's slide 30 of the presentation, right after our question slide, I've given you some references so that you can take a look at Kotter's work and then decide as to what you would want to pursue. Now, in addition to this, you can take a look at this. This is resistance prevention. There is also Emery's work in terms of resistance corrective action. What are the expectations of the change? You may have communicated them, but I can tell you up front that communication is typically interpreted in different ways. In fact, most communications can be interpreted maybe 3 different ways. So it might be good. In fact, I would highly recommend if someone resists, ask, well, what was your expectation of this change of why? Of not just why, but what would the results be? How did you interpret the changes that we communicated to you? And they may have some very good reasons why, maybe things that we haven't considered, or their interpretation is a miscommunication. So also resistance may be due to a relationship, maybe the relationship between you and that particular stakeholder, or there might be some outside influences that we may not be aware of. So look at it in terms of resistance to change. Look at, I'm going to go back a slide. Let me just go back one. Look at it in terms of, did I state the urgency? Have I formed a coalition here of people of similar thinking? Did I create a vision for the change? This all has to do with resistance prevention. And then, of course, corrective action when resistance actually happens to you. So think about this while you're doing the define. Think about asking your process owners, are they risk prone or risk adverse? Think about the various different changes that will happen to various people within the actual process. You can look at it as prevention, getting people involved in your process up front, or you can look at it in terms of corrective action. They're resisting. Now ask, what was their expectation, okay, of any changes that you may be promoting? Okay, again, Emery and Kotter's references are in slide 30, okay, of this presentation. Let me go now to just some principles of change that I always hold to, and I would suggest for you to think about as you do this. Most people will drop resistance and evolve to accepting the change when they believe that the next step they're going to fall in the ditch or fall over the cliff. In other words, they may resist and resist until you state what the urgency is. It was a very interesting movie, okay, that came out several years ago, and there were 2 different versions of it. It was called When the World Stood Still, or When the Earth Stood Still. And it really came down to many people resisted about what was happening, let's say, to their environment. And until they really understood what was the actual result, they kept resisting and resisting to change. It's a very interesting movie if you ever get a chance to watch it. You'll find the same thing in an organization. People will resist change until you have described the urgency to them. Also, okay, you'll notice here in the next 2 bullets here, we say, well, where, right, the change originates constitutes the level of resistance. It's very important to get people involved from the very beginning of your effort, your business process management effort. In other words, people are more willing to accept a change when they have been part of it, when they have actually participated. It's not imposed on them. So think about that, establishing the urgency, and think about getting people involved early in the process, okay, to lower that resistance. And at the same time, note this last one. Resistance grows as change approaches. Okay, the proximity of an individual. Let me give you an example. I'm with a bunch of executives. I mentioned to them we're going to change these processes, and they're all for it. And I said, yes, by golly, we should do that. And I said, well, we may get some resistance, but we have to really have them understand, okay, why this change is necessary. Describe the urgency to them. And some executives will say, well, you know, you're absolutely correct, and those people have to adapt to those changes of the process. I know they've been doing it a certain way for a long time, but they need to adapt. And then I say this. Well, this change also constitutes some changes that we're going to have in the organization. In fact, we may be consolidating some of the functions, and there'll be less management positions. Now you're going to see resistance in that meeting. Wait a minute, you're saying you're going to change the organization chart in order for these processes to run correctly or more efficiently? Well, how does that impact us here? Here comes the resistance, because now it affects them. So I want you to keep that in mind. Resistance is very natural, and it's going to maybe change lots of different levels, okay, within the in the organization. So don't look at it just in one place. Look at it, and it can happen in various different places, and it grows depending on the proximity to that particular individual. Okay, so I wanted to bring that up. Remember here, the theme is in terms of change, right, that we need to manage change, manage resistance, expect resistance all the way through the project. Do your resistance prevention, do your resistance corrective action. Here's the reference cards I mentioned to you before. I have several of these that I have built to make the job of doing a process redesign or incremental improvement analysis a little bit easier. You may want to take a look at some of these cards. I provided one here. This is the front, and this is the back of the card. I've also put in the actual Ishikawa diagram. Oops, let me go back. There we go. Ishikawa diagram that I use when I do incremental improvement as well as process redesign. And in the card, it has the various different aspects and various questions to ask. It's always good to know what questions to ask to come up with whatever improvements that you might then develop. All right, so anyway, I have provided that card for you, and now we're here to sort of the summary here of our webinar. So let's just go through this of what we've talked about. We want to manage a business by process rather than by function. Remember, one of the problems you could get into is looking at a sub-process, okay, rather than an entire value chain. We want to look at these various projects for BPM in terms of maybe we have a specific problem today or an opportunity, or we may want to review our processes on, let's say, every 3 or 4 years, at least our major core processes. Many processes today in business, and this is true in the private sector as well as in the public sector, have not been reviewed for many, many years. And also, one of the things I wanted to emphasize, many people don't know what business rules are used to make certain decisions in those processes. So think of the metric goal that is set by your process owner to come up whether it's going to be a redesign or an incremental improvement. For success, make sure that you align those efficient processes with effective customer products. To do a thorough analysis, make sure you look at value change, not just sub-processes. Also look at making sure that you establish lagging and leading metrics for your control area, the control stage, to come up with trend and control reports. And remember that metrics only show you where a problem exists. You need to use a root cause analysis and say the 5 whys to come up with the actual cause itself. The biggest challenge, and you should not forget this, is going to be to managing that resistance. Look at your proposals and stage them in terms of how much risk are you taking on. Don't just make one proposal. Spread it out depending on the risk. We also talked about the 4 different phases of the BPM life cycle. Okay, with that, I'm just about at an hour, so let me ask if we have any questions. I have documented some typical questions that I get, so let me just go through those quickly, and then we'll take a look to see what other questions that we may have. Let's see here. I have received this question quite a bit. What if a process owner is not able to give us a metric goal during the define stage, or perhaps even refuses to actually set a metric goal like 50% or 10% or 20%? I would advise you, okay, to make the process owner understand that the metric goal is going to lead to the approach of either small incremental improvements or a redesign. And if you still have a problem there, in other words, the process owner doesn't want to give you a metric, then I would give them an expectation that, well, you're going to, let's say, probably get an expectation of maybe a 10 to 20% improvement. That's how I would set the expectation. Another one is, what if your current process doesn't have metrics? That's a tough spot to be put in. What happens now is that, well, you sort of wonder, well, gee, how in fact, how in the world did they manage the process before? That's probably a good discussion to have. But you're probably going to have to promote that you're going to have to put in some metrics, some overhead for those metrics, in order for us to even do, let's say, a business case of moving from the as is to the to be, because how else can you actually show that there has been an improvement? Okay, so those are a couple of questions that I get. I'm taking a look here at the other questions. Let's see, I'm getting some thank yous. That's always good. Thank you very much. Let's see, can you help me? Here's one. Let's see, can you help me understand if we need to focus on short-term wins for resistance prevention? I would say that that's a good approach. Kotter has said in his work, and you can again look at the reference of Kotter, and let me just say, in fact, if you go to page, to slide 30, if I go to the next one here, you'll see that there's all kinds of references in here for Kotter and Remy and other different individuals. So if you get a copy of this presentation, look at those as well as the various different explanation of terms that I have at the end of this presentation. But these references are most important. But I can tell you that Kotter, that recommendation, okay, is that always go for the short win, because you establish then a rapport with your process owner, a certain level of trust, which will hopefully then lower resistance. So my answer to you is there, yes. And this is in harmony with Kotter. Go for the short win, and then go to something more complicated a little bit later. Okay, I think I've spent my time here, so I know that Tracy wants to say some things. And And also we may have some words here from our sponsor. Again, I want to thank Modern Analyst again, and certainly our sponsor, the Freeman Group here, the RGF group, for their kind sponsorship. Okay, Tracy?
Mark, thank you. What an excellent presentation today. There's certainly a tremendous amount of questions and lovely comments for you. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with a video and the PDF of the presentation, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for our sponsors, RG Freeman Group. Have a great day.